In a chemical reaction, we're going to have two parts. We're going to have the reactants, which are on the left side of the equation, and we're going to have the products. They're both separated by an arrow that reads forms. So in this case, we're going to have that the reactants form the products. That's how you will read it. Now, to this we call a chemical equation. So the chemical equation is a representation of a chemical reaction. For the purposes of this chapter, we're going to look a little deeper into what these chemical reactions are. We're going to focus mainly in combustion and also how many of these air pollutants are produced. So one of the pollutants that we have learned about is CO2, carbon dioxide. But how is it formed? So carbon dioxide is the product of the reaction between carbon and oxygen. Now remember that oxygen is one of those few elements that in nature is found as a gas, and we have two atoms of oxygen combined. So carbon plus oxygen form carbon dioxide. Now the plus could be read as react with. So carbon reacts with oxygen to form carbon dioxide. When looking at a chemical equation, there is something else that we need to focus on and pay very important attention to, and that is called the law of conservation of matter and mass. So what it tells us is that atoms are neither created nor destroyed in a chemical reaction. Therefore, I should have equal amounts of atoms on the reactant side and the product side. So if we look at this chemical equation, we have one atom of carbon, two atoms of oxygen on the reactant side, and we have one atom of carbon and two atoms of oxygen. So the question is this does this chemical equation follow the law of conservation of matter and mass? And we can say that yes, it does, because we have equal amounts of each element on both sides of the equation, in reactants and the products. Let's look at another example. If I have S plus O2, meaning sulfur, plus oxygen, what do I form? I'm going to form SO2, or sulfur dioxide. My question is the equation balanced? So when we ask about, or we talk about balancing, we're referring to the law of conservation of mass and matter. So do we have equal amounts of sulfur and oxygen both in the reactants and in the products? So for that, we can just make a very simple list. So if I look at this, in my reactants, I have one atom of sulfur and two atoms of oxygen. In my products, as it is, I have 1 atom of sulfur and 2 atoms of oxygen. So I can say that yes, my equation is balanced. So there is nothing I really need to do in order to balance my chemical equation. In other cases, for instance, when I have nitrogen gas react with oxygen gas, I can also use a G in parentheses to represent the state in which each of these elements is for the reaction. So I have nitrogen gas react with oxygen gas. I'm going to find that it produces NO gaseous. So my question is this equation balanced? So I go back to numbering my reactants against my products. So I have 2 atoms of nitrogen, 2 atoms of oxygen in the reactants, have 1 atom of nitrogen, 1 atom of oxygen in my products. So is the equation balanced? No. Since it's not balanced, what can I do to balance the equation? So I'm going to use coefficients in front of each of the elements in order to balance it. I have 2 of nitrogen, 2 oxygen, 2 oxygen, 2 nitrogen, 2 nitrogen. For a factor of 2, I need to increase the number of nitrogen and oxygen in my products. So I can add a coefficient in front of the nitrogen and oxygen compound, which is nitrogen monoxide, to balance my equation. Now, this coefficient that I add will affect the number of atoms in the whole molecule. So I'm going to have now 2 atoms of nitrogen and 2 atoms of oxygen in my products. Therefore, my equation is balanced. Let's practice in the next slide.